The heat clung to the concrete like sweat on skin, rising in waves that blurred the edge of everything. But nothing about that morning felt slow. A black man, stooped with age, moved across the cracked sidewalk with the deliberate grace of someone who'd earned every ache in his bones. His limp was steady, a silent rhythm that matched the tap of his polished cane. His face was carved in stillness, eyes focused forward, ignoring the weight of every glance he'd learned to endure. Across the street, a white patrol car idled, its engine low and predatory. Inside sat Officer Cole Maddox, young, brimming with self-importance, bored and scanning the world through a lens tinted by years of inherited contempt. His gaze locked on the old man like a target. No crime, no cause, just a gut feeling, the kind that grew from years of being told who was suspicious by the way they walked. With a smirk crawling across his face, Maddox stepped out, one hand resting near his belt, the other adjusting his badge like armor. "You lost, old man," he called out, loud enough for the people on the block to hear. The elder said nothing, didn't even break stride. Maddox didn't like that. He crossed the street in quick, purposeful steps, his boots clapping against the pavement like warnings. "What's with the limp?" he sneered, now walking beside the man, mocking his uneven steps with exaggerated movements, throwing his shoulder and hip out like he was doing a cruel dance. A few heads turned, some in shock, most in silence. The elder paused, finally, not from fear, but from sheer necessity. His leg trembled slightly, the pain flaring behind his calm eyes. Maddox leaned in closer. "That real, or just for sympathy points?" He spat, his grin venomous. The man still said nothing. He just looked at the officer, not with hate, not with anger, but with a kind of still, piercing knowing. It was the look of someone who had buried friends in foreign soil, who had fought for a country that never fought for him, who had bled in silence and came home to be spat on. Maddox didn't see it. All he saw was a man who dared not to cower. He reached for the cane, pretending to inspect it, but really, just trying to strip away the last bit of dignity. "Looks government issued," he muttered, twisting it in his hand like a toy. "Funny how you'll always find a way to take advantage of the system." The man finally spoke. Just 2 words, quiet as breath. "You don't know." Maddox blinked, caught off guard, but then laughed. "Don't know what? That you're a scam artist? That you're too lazy to walk straight?" But the man was already turning away, slowly, his cane steady beneath him like a soldier's final salute. Maddox watched him leave, fuming, confused, unaware that his taunt had just bounced off the walls of history and cracked something wide open he'd never be ready to face. The next morning, the sun rose with the same oppressive heat, but the energy on the street had shifted, subtly, like the air before a storm. Officer Maddox was back in the same spot, leaning against his cruiser with a paper cup in hand and arrogance written across his face like a badge. He hadn't forgotten the old man, not because he posed a threat, but because he hadn't shown fear, and that alone had gnawed at Maddox like a splinter he couldn't dig out. When he spotted him again, same limp, same coat, same cane tapping in rhythm with each step, Maddox smiled to himself. Not a friendly smile, but the kind a predator wears before it circles back to unfinished business. He didn't wait this time. He strode across the street, cup discarded, hand already near his radio in case he wanted to frame this as official interaction. "Back again, huh? Thought you'd learned your lesson yesterday?" he barked, his voice slicing through the quiet. The old man didn't answer, just kept walking with that same slow, steady pace. It infuriated Maddox. "You ignoring me now?" he snapped, stepping in front of him, blocking his path. "You think you're better than me?" A few bystanders began to watch, some from windows, others frozen on the sidewalk, but none stepped forward. Maddox turned to the small group near the corner and shouted, "Anyone know this guy? You let him limp around here like he owns the place?" He turned back to the man, now inches from his face. "I asked you a question, old man. Why don't you stop pretending that Limp's real and show some respect when law enforcement's talking to you?" Still silence. Maddox leaned in closer, voice low and venomous. "You people think you can walk around with your heads high because some politician told you it's your time now. Well, not on my watch. He grabbed the cane without warning, yanking it from the man's hand and holding it up like a trophy. The old man stumbled, nearly falling, catching himself on a lamppost with visible effort. The cane dangled in Maddox's grip, the officer waving it mockingly in the air like it was some cheap prop. Look at this thing. Probably government paid, huh? Bet you worked real hard to get this, for 5 minutes before filing for benefits. Someone in the crowd gasped. A woman clutched her purse tighter and turned away. Another man lifted his phone halfway, then lowered it again. The atmosphere was thick with cowardice. Not because they agreed, but because they'd seen how speaking out ended for people who looked like them. Maddox dropped the cane on the curb with a loud clack, then stepped on it. Not enough to break it, but just enough to show the intent. "You want it?" he said, tilting his head. "Crawl for it." The old man didn't move. His eyes were on the cane, but his dignity stood firm, shoulders squared, spine straight despite the pain. Maddox scoffed, turned his back, and walked away laughing, muttering something about how entitlement ruins discipline. The crowd dispersed slowly, not from satisfaction, but from shame, and the old man, after a long pause, leaned down, picked up his cane, brushed off the dirt, and kept walking. Not a word spoken, not a glance backward. But as he moved on, something in the air shifted again, not with noise, not with force, but with the quiet, focused energy of someone who had been through far worse and who understood that revenge didn't always come in fire. Sometimes it came in silence. Sometimes it came when the world least expected it, and this time it was already coming. The city pulsed with indifference as the days moved on, swallowing one injustice after another in its endless appetite for noise and distraction. But something about the moment on that street corner lingered. It wasn't the brutality of it. No blood had been spilled, no gun drawn. It was the cruelty that came wrapped in laughter, the humiliation served casually in broad daylight. Officer Maddox had reduced a man to a spectacle, and in doing so, reminded everyone watching what it meant to be powerless. The old man returned, as he always did. Same limp, same coat, same cane. But now, every step was shadowed by memory. People recognized him. Some nodded quietly, some looked away. Others avoided his eyes altogether, ashamed not because of what they'd done, but because of what they hadn't. Maddox, meanwhile, grew bolder. The attention made him feel important, like his cruelty had earned him something. He joked with his partner about Mr. Civil Rights limping down the avenue. He reenacted the moment in the precinct break room, mocking the man's posture to a crowd of officers whose laughter was half-hearted, but present. No one questioned him. No one stopped him. His badge gave him more than authority. It gave him permission. The next time he saw the old man, it wasn't enough to insult him from afar. Maddox approached slowly, wearing a smirk like a weapon. "Back for more?" he said, stepping directly into the man's path. "I figured you'd learn by now. You like the attention, huh? You miss the old days when people marched and sang songs and thought that made a difference?" The old man remained silent, eyes straight ahead. Maddox stepped closer. "Tell me something. Where were you when real work was being done? You look like the kind who stayed behind while others fought. Probably faked an injury to stay off the front lines." For the first time, the old man's lips parted, not in protest, but in something deeper, pain masked in stillness. Maddox mistook it for guilt. "Yeah, that's what I thought. All limp, no legacy," he hissed. Then, louder, for everyone around to hear, "Don't let the cane fool you, folks. This guy's been playing the system longer than most of you have been alive." The small crowd that had gathered didn't laugh this time. A woman watching from across the street pulled out her phone and began recording quietly, capturing the moment, the posture, the way the old man held his ground without saying a word. Maddox noticed but didn't stop. He was too deep into the performance. "Why don't you say something, huh? Lost your voice like you lost your pride." Still, the man said nothing. He simply raised his hand, slow and steady, and pointed. Not at Maddox, not at the crowd, but at the American flag waving from a pole above the courthouse across the street. The symbol didn't need words. Maddox followed the gesture, confused for a moment, then rolled his eyes. "Yeah, sure. Patriot. What did you do? Write letters during the war? But no answer came. The man walked past him, step by painful step, as if the street belonged to him, and Maddox was just a whisper in the wind. The officer's smirk faded as the silence swallowed him. The moment didn't feel victorious. It felt hollow, like he'd tried to burn down a house and realized too late the walls were made of stone. Behind him, the woman with the phone lowered her camera and whispered, "You have no idea who that man is." And for the first time, Maddox felt something unfamiliar, uncertainty. It clung to him like heat, and he didn't know why. Not yet, but something in the air had shifted, and the man he mocked would not remain nameless much longer. Let's take a short pause. Tell us in the comments, where are you listening from, and have you ever experienced or witnessed something like this in your own life? We'd love to hear your story. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what's coming next. Now, we continue. The sun had long disappeared behind the buildings when the old man finally reached the narrow stairwell leading to his small apartment above a forgotten corner store. Each step was a quiet war, his legs stiff with pain, but his grip on the cane was steady. Inside, the room was dim, worn and quiet, walls yellowed with time, furniture minimal, the kind of place where history lived in silence. He closed the door behind him without a sound and removed his coat slowly, folding it as if it carried more weight than mere fabric. Then, as he had done for years, he walked to the far wall where a modest wooden cabinet stood. He opened it gently. Inside were medals, dozens, rows of bronze and silver, stars and stripes, each one pinned beside photos that told stories the world outside had forgotten or chosen to ignore. A younger version of himself looked out from those pictures, standing in uniform, saluting with the precision of a soldier who had once believed his sacrifice meant something. Combat ribbons, a Purple Heart, even a Legion of Merit. He had fought overseas, bled in jungles and deserts, carried brothers through smoke and gunfire. But none of that mattered to the officer on the street. None of that was seen. To him, he was just a slow-walking, cane-carrying black man, existing in a space that others felt he didn't deserve. He traced one of the medals with his finger, not out of pride, but out of mourning, for a country that had demanded everything and returned so little. He didn't need recognition. He didn't want fame. But the humiliation he had endured wasn't just personal. It was generational. It was every time someone who looked like him had to shrink themselves just to move through the world in peace. Every time they were spat on in uniform. Every time their salute was ignored. Every time a man like Maddox stepped on a cane like it was trash. He sat down slowly, the silence wrapping around him like a blanket, but inside something burned. He remembered the names of the men he'd served with. Some white, some black, all equal in death. Yet here he was, decades later, being treated like an intruder on his own street. He pulled out a faded journal and began to write. Not because he needed to vent, but because truth mattered. One day, someone would read it. Someone would understand that his limp wasn't weakness. It was the price of loyalty, and someone would know that the man being mocked on the street had once stood taller than most would ever dare. The war had changed him, but it was peace that had broken him. And now, as the city slept, he sat among dust and medals, haunted by a question he could never shake. What had he truly been fighting for? The following days were filled with the quiet hum of routine, but the old man could feel something building, something that had been set into motion the moment Officer Maddox mocked him in the street. He hadn't expected anything to change, not for himself, but the world had a funny way of reacting to things once they were exposed. And for better or worse, his silence had forced people to notice, whether they wanted to or not. Jeremiah Holloway, the old man's son, had been watching from afar. Not in the way a son would watch his father to learn, but with the careful eyes of a journalist who had made a career out of exposing the rot within systems of power. He had seen his father suffer in silence for decades, witnessed the humiliations, the casual slights, the subtle denials that came with being black in a world that always assumed you were less. But it was the events of that day, when his father had been mocked on the street by an officer who didn't even know the first thing about him, that finally broke through his professional detachment. Jeremiah had spent his life using his platform to speak for others, to uncover the truth about the injustice that ran deep through the veins of the city. but he had never felt it so sharply as he did now. The case wasn't just a story, it was personal. His father, a man who had served his country, who had fought for freedoms that were never extended to him, had been reduced to nothing more than a target for a boy in a badge. A boy who had no understanding of the sacrifices his father had made, no appreciation for the weight of history that shaped the very man he had mocked. Jeremiah had spent hours that night, sitting at his desk in the small apartment he kept in the city, scrolling through footage of the incident. It had gone viral almost immediately. People had begun to share it, mostly in outrage, some in disbelief, and a few with the cold indifference that could only come from those who had never been on the receiving end of such cruelty. His father had been humiliated on the street, but more than that, the incident had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the way black people were treated by law enforcement, a symbol of the endless cycle of abuse, disrespect, and dehumanization that had continued unchecked for generations. Jeremiah closed his laptop with a quiet snap, rubbing his face in frustration. His father had lived through this for years, decades even. The struggle, the humiliation, the endless barrage of tiny insults, each one chipping away at his sense of worth. But this was something different. It wasn't just the abuse of power. It was the complete erasure of his father's humanity. It was the blind spot in Officer Maddox's eyes when he looked at the man who had served his country with distinction, who had fought in wars and saved lives, and saw only a crippled old man, a problem, a nuisance. Jeremiah's phone buzzed beside him. It was a text message from his mother. "Your father won't talk about it, but I can see it in his eyes. He's not as strong as he used to be." Jeremiah stared at the message for a long time. He hadn't expected his father to react any differently. The old man was a stoic, a man who had never asked for anything in his life. He had endured so much over the years, and somehow it had always been easier for him to bury the pain, to push it down until it disappeared in the background of his mind. But that wasn't the way the world worked. The world never let you forget, and it never let you off the hook. Jeremiah leaned back in his chair, staring out the window into the street below. He thought about his father's face, the way he had looked at Officer Maddox with those steady, unflinching eyes, the way he had simply turned and walked away, despite the pain in his leg, despite the rage that had to be bubbling inside of him. And yet, his father had shown restraint. He had chosen silence over confrontation, but Jeremiah knew better. Silence had never been a choice for the black community. Silence was what kept them from being heard. Silence was what allowed the system to persist, to continue to oppress and destroy. It wasn't just about his father anymore. This was about something bigger. This was about the way the system treated people like his father, like him, like every black person who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, and vilified. This was about the fight for justice that had been raging for centuries, a fight that had been buried in the shadow of those in power who believed their skin color made them invincible. But Jeremiah was tired of fighting quietly. He was tired of sitting on the sidelines and waiting for change to come. He had a platform, he had a voice, and now he was going to use it. The next morning, he made a call to his editor, telling them that he had a story, a big one, a story that needed to be told. He knew the risks. He knew what would happen when the people in power found out what he was about to do, but he couldn't stay silent anymore. His father had taught him better than that. By the time the article was published, it had already started to gain traction. The headline was simple, but devastating. Black War Hero, mocked by officer in broad daylight, the story of an America that forgets its own. The article delved into his father's history, his service in the military, his awards, his sacrifice. It painted a picture of a man who had given everything for a country that had never fully embraced him. A man who had endured more than most could ever imagine, and yet, still, was treated with contempt by a system designed to keep him in his place. The reaction was immediate. The video of the incident spread even faster. People began sharing it, retweeting it, commenting on it, debating it. Some stood in outrage. Others tried to justify the officer's behavior, claiming that he was just doing his job. But Jeremiah knew what this was really about. It wasn't just about one cop. It was about a culture that had allowed men like Maddox to act with impunity. A culture that had conditioned people to believe that certain lives didn't matter. And then came the phone calls. From the police chief, from the mayor, from influential figures who wanted to make sure this story didn't go any further, who wanted to control the narrative before it got out of hand. They tried to paint his father as just another victim, another statistic in a long line of injustices. But they couldn't. Not this time. Not with the truth out in the open. The police department released a statement, promising an internal review of the officer's conduct. But Jeremiah knew it was just words. Meaningless words designed to appease the public for a moment before everything went back to normal. He wasn't interested in apologies. He wasn't interested in statements. He was interested in justice. Real justice. The kind that didn't come with a slap on the wrist and a promise to do better next time. He wanted accountability. He wanted the world to know that men like his father, men who had fought and bled for this country, would no longer be silenced. And then, as if the world had been waiting for the tipping point, the protests began. People who had long been silent started to speak up. The streets filled with people. Black and white, young and old, demanding justice for the old man who had been mocked. Demanding justice for the countless others who had suffered at the hands of law enforcement. Demanding a world where no one was ever treated as less than human. Jeremiah stood at the front of the march, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. This was his fight now. This was his father's fight. And together, they would make sure their voices were heard. Because no matter how much the system tried to silence them, no matter how many times they were pushed to the margins, they would never stop fighting for the justice that was long overdue. The city had never been more awake, more alive with voices calling for change. What had started as a single story of an old man mocked by a cop had become a battleground of ideals, a microcosm of the systemic injustices that had been allowed to fester for centuries. What the world didn't know, though, was that the real battle had already begun behind the scenes. The battle for truth, for power, for control over the narrative. And Jeremiah Holloway was right at the center of it. Jeremiah had known that this moment was coming. The protests that had followed his article, the outpouring of support from people who had long been silenced, had ignited a flame that couldn't be easily put out. But with that flame came the smoke, the backlash, the threats, the attempts to discredit everything he stood for. The system, when faced with the reality of its own corruption, didn't back down. It retaliated, and Jeremiah had no illusions about the war he was stepping into. The phone calls started almost immediately. Some came from anonymous sources, others from those who had tried to bury the truth for years. People in power, people who didn't want the spotlight shone on their dirty little secrets, tried to offer Jeremiah deals, silent agreements, hush money, even empty promises of reform. But Jeremiah was no fool. He had seen this game played before. He had been on the other side of it, uncovering corruption, digging into the hidden corners where the truth had been buried. But now the truth was his weapon, and he would not let it be twisted or silenced. As the days wore on, the tensions escalated. The protests grew larger, louder, more intense. Marchers filled the streets, demanding justice for his father and for all those who had been abused, neglected, or ignored by a system that had long seen them as expendable. But the city's response, the response from those in power, was swift and harsh. The police presence was overwhelming. More officers, more barricades, more checkpoints. They tried to contain the narrative, to control the chaos that had erupted. But it was clear that the people wouldn't be silenced, not this time. Behind closed doors, the conversations grew more sinister. Jeremiah knew that there were powerful people who saw him not as a journalist, not as a son trying to get justice for his father, but as a threat to the order they had worked so hard to maintain. They didn't care about the truth. They didn't care about the lives that had been ruined, the families that had been torn apart by their indifference. All they cared about was power. And if that power had to be maintained by crushing one man, one family, so be it. It wasn't long before the attacks on Jeremiah began. At first, they were subtle, a smear campaign designed to undermine his credibility. Journalists who had once admired him now started to question his motives, accusing him of using his father's story as a way to further his own career. They twisted his words, took them out of context, and painted him as a man who was manipulating the truth for his own gain. And the worst part? It worked. The public, always so eager to latch onto the latest scandal, began to turn on him. They started to question his integrity. They started to doubt his intentions. Jeremiah's phone buzzed late one night as he sat alone in his office, surrounded by piles of papers, the weight of the truth hanging heavily in the air. It was a message from his editor. "The pressure's mounting. They're coming after you. I've been told to pull back." Jeremiah read the message twice, the words sinking in. He knew what it meant. It meant that the media, his own allies, were folding. They were afraid. And who could blame them? They saw the way things were going, saw the backlash against him and his father's story. They knew the consequences. The people in power were pulling strings, exerting influence, and they had the money to make sure the truth would remain buried. Jeremiah leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. He felt the weight of it all, the isolation, the fear, the sense that he was fighting a battle that might be too big to win. But then he thought of his father. He thought of the humiliation, the laughter, the way the world had turned its back on him time and time again. He thought of the men his father had fought alongside, the brothers who had bled and died for a country that never fully accepted them. He thought of the generations of black men and women who had suffered under the heel of this system, who had been silenced, whose stories had never been told. And suddenly, the weight didn't feel so heavy anymore, because it wasn't just about him, it was about them. It was about the truth that needed to be told, no matter the cost. Jeremiah stood up, his fists clenched. He wasn't backing down. He wouldn't let them win. He had a responsibility now, one that went beyond being a son, beyond being a journalist. He had become the voice for his father, for every black man and woman who had been humiliated, mocked, ignored. He had become the one person in a city full of apathy who was willing to fight, to stand in the light and say, "This is wrong. This has always been wrong." And so, the next day, he returned to the streets, the scene of the crime, the place where it all started. The protests were bigger now, louder, a constant hum that filled the air. The streets were lined with signs, fists raised in defiance, and the words, "Justice for the forgotten," echoed in every corner. But it wasn't just a protest anymore. It was a movement. It was a war for truth, a war for dignity, a war that had been fought in silence for too long, but now it was coming to the surface. The police presence was overwhelming. Officers stood in rows, their faces stern, their bodies tense. They had been told to control the crowd, to break it up if necessary. But there was something different about this protest. Something different about the way the people were moving, their eyes shining with determination. Jeremiah walked through the crowd, feeling the power of it, the weight of the people behind him. His father had always told him to stand tall, to never shrink away from a fight. And today, that advice was more important than ever. As he made his way to the front, the voices grew louder, the chants more urgent. And then, there it was. At the head of the protest, standing tall and proud, was his father. The old man had come, despite the pain, despite the humiliation. He stood with the crowd, no cane in his hand, his back straight, his eyes focused. The man who had once been mocked, once reduced to a joke, now stood as a symbol of strength, a symbol of resilience, a symbol of everything the world had tried to bury. Jeremiah walked up to him, their eyes meeting for the first time in days. There was no need for words. They both knew what was happening. They both knew what they had to do. Together, father and son, they stood tall in front of the crowd, the weight of history and the strength of the people behind them. The moment was electric. The world was watching. The system was watching. And for the first time, it felt like something might actually change. The police had been given orders to disperse the crowd, to use force if necessary. But something in the air had shifted. The people were no longer afraid. They were no longer the silent majority. They were the majority. And this time, they were fighting back. Jeremiah and his father didn't move. They stood together, their faces resolute, knowing that they had already won. Because in this moment, the truth was undeniable. The fight was no longer about a single officer, a single incident. It was about the thousands of lives that had been crushed under the weight of injustice. the countless voices that had been silenced for far too long. And for the first time, those voices were being heard. The march continued, the chants growing louder, the movement growing stronger. And Jeremiah knew, deep in his bones, that the war for justice had only just begun. But this time, the people were ready, and the system was shaking. The tension in the city was like an electric current, crackling in the air, both thrilling and terrifying. The protests had grown not only in size, but in intensity. What had begun as a single act of cruelty, the mocking of an elderly black man by an officer who thought he could get away with it, had ignited something deep within the hearts of people who had been silent for far too long. What started as an isolated incident, a personal humiliation, had now become a full-scale reckoning. It wasn't just about the man who had been mocked on the street. It was about all the invisible lives that had been trampled over by a system that had decided who mattered and who didn't. Jeremiah Holloway had fought for years, uncovering stories that no one wanted to hear, exposing injustices that had been swept under the rug. But this was different. His father's humiliation had forced him into the front lines of a battle he had been preparing for his whole life, but had never expected to fight. The protests had become more than a call for justice for his father. They had become a call for justice for everyone who had been silenced, oppressed, and ignored. The police, the politicians, the powers that be. None of them had expected the fire they had sparked to burn so brightly. The night was thick with the sound of shouting. Jeremiah had been at the heart of it all, speaking to crowds, leading marches, and pushing forward with his father at his side. The old man, despite his age and the toll time had taken on his body, stood with pride, his cane a symbol of endurance rather than weakness. He had been mocked, humiliated, but now, with every step he took, he carried not only his own story, but the stories of every black person who had suffered under the weight of systemic oppression. But not everyone was ready for the change. In fact, most of those in power were scrambling to maintain control, clinging to the institutions that had protected them for so long. They knew that the protests weren't just about one officer. They were about the entire system, about the police, the courts, the structures that had kept power in the hands of the few, while leaving the rest of the city to fend for themselves. The pushback had begun, and it was vicious. Jeremiah had received several anonymous threats that were increasingly difficult to ignore. The police chief, the mayor, even local politicians, all had tried to influence him, to get him to back down, to let the issue fade into the background. But Jeremiah knew better. He had watched the system for too long. He knew that they only moved when they were pushed, and he was pushing now, harder than he ever had before. The pressure weighed heavily on him, though. He could feel the walls closing in. The stories were growing louder, but so was the opposition. The mayor, desperate to protect the city's image, had ordered the police to crack down on the protests, to use whatever force necessary to quell the growing unrest. The media, once eager to cover the story, was now questioning the legitimacy of the protests, painting them as violent, disruptive, dangerous. They ignored the fact that it was the system itself that had created this unrest. It was a Friday evening when it all came to a head. Jeremiah had been following the developments closely, coordinating with activists, journalists, and legal teams to make sure that everything was documented, that every move was captured, every word spoken was heard. He knew the stakes were higher now than they had ever been. The people who had been silent for so long were finally finding their voices, and they weren't going to let them be stolen again. He had received a call earlier that day from one of his sources in the police department. The officer who had mocked his father, Officer Maddox, was scheduled to make a public statement about the incident. It was clear from the call that the department was trying to downplay the situation, to offer a half-hearted apology and hope the protests would dissipate. But Jeremiah knew it wasn't that simple. Maddox wasn't just a rogue officer. He was a symptom of a much larger problem, one that had festered for years, ignored by those in power. He couldn't let the story be swept under the rug. Not this time. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the city, Jeremiah stood at the front of the protest, his father beside him. The crowd was larger than ever, a sea of faces, of fists raised, of voices chanting for justice. They had gathered outside City Hall, and the air was thick with anticipation. They knew that tonight, something would happen. They weren't sure what, but they knew they were on the precipice of something big. The police presence was overwhelming. Officers lined the streets, blocking off entrances to the square, their eyes cold and watchful. But this time, the crowd wasn't afraid. The chants grew louder, the rhythm of their voices pulsing through the air like a heartbeat. They were demanding answers, demanding accountability, demanding that the officers who had abused their power be held responsible. And they were making it clear that they wouldn't stop until they got it. Jeremiah looked around him. The people were tired. They were tired of the lies, the injustice, the endless cycle of being treated like they didn't matter. The elderly, the young, black and white. They were all there, standing side by side, united in their demand for change. It was a powerful moment, one that filled Jeremiah's chest with both pride and fear. This wasn't just about his father anymore. It was about all of them. It was about everyone who had been told that their lives didn't matter. And it was about tearing down the structures that had allowed that message to be sent for so long. The night dragged on, the protests swelling with more people, more voices. But as the evening wore on, tensions began to rise. The police, under orders from the mayor, started to move in. They began pushing the crowd back, slowly but steadily, using their presence to intimidate, to control. And when the crowd resisted, when they pushed back, the police responded with force. Jeremiah could feel the air shift. The chants grew louder, more urgent, more desperate. The crowd, now seething with anger and frustration, pressed forward, unwilling to give up ground. It was then that the first flash of violence erupted. A group of officers moved into the crowd, swinging their batons, shoving people aside. It wasn't a full-scale riot yet, but it was clear that the city was at a breaking point. Jeremiah, standing at the front, felt the surge of emotion. He knew what was coming. He knew that this was no longer just about his father. It was about something much larger. This wasn't just a protest anymore. It was a rebellion, a call for justice that couldn't be ignored. He turned to his father, who had been standing quietly beside him, watching the scene unfold with calm eyes. The old man didn't say anything, but there was a deep understanding between them. The battles they had fought, the wars they had been part of, had always been about more than just the fights themselves. It had always been about survival, about making sure their voices were heard even when the world tried to silence them. Jeremiah raised his fist into the air, and the crowd followed suit, their voices rising louder, shaking the very ground beneath them. It was a moment of power, of unity, and it was a moment that would change everything. But then, the police struck again, more violently this time. Officers began to push into the crowd, forcing them back with more brutality. Jeremiah could see the panic on the faces of the people around him. Some of them scared, some of them angry, all of them unwilling to back down. And then, in the chaos, he saw it. Officer Maddox, the man who had started it all, stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the violence unfold. He wasn't moving to intervene. He was standing there, a look of smug satisfaction on his face, as if he was watching the world burn. That was when the realization hit him. This wasn't just about his father anymore. This was about all of them. The people who had been marginalized, who had been forgotten, who had been treated as less than human for far too long. This was about everything that had been built on their suffering, everything that had allowed men like Maddox to rise to power. And as the chaos erupted around him, Jeremiah knew that this moment was only the beginning. The reckoning had come, and there was no turning back. The streetlights flickered in the aftermath, casting long shadows over the protesters who had now become a seething mass of defiance, pain, and adrenaline. The city's streets, once familiar, had transformed into battlegrounds, a clash between those who fought for a system of equality and justice, and those who had spent their lives entrenched in power, determined to protect a status quo that had oppressed so many for so long. And at the center of it all, standing with fists raised, was Jeremiah Holloway, his father by his side, and a crowd that had grown so large it seemed to ripple through the city like a tide. The chaos, the noise, the violence, it all blended together, creating a single overwhelming force that felt unstoppable. The police, under orders from the mayor, began moving through the crowd with brutal efficiency. Maddox, the officer whose actions had sparked this fire, stood behind a barricade, watching, his hands gripping the baton at his side. His eyes were cold, filled with a mixture of arrogance and disbelief. He had not expected this. He had not expected that one old man, mocked and humiliated on the streets, would ignite a revolution. And he had certainly not expected to be standing in the midst of a fight he never thought he would have to face. Maddox's heart pounded in his chest, but not with fear. It was something deeper, something more primal. There was nothing but rage in his veins now. It had started as a simple moment, mocking an old man, showing the world his supposed power. Now, that moment had spiraled into something much larger, something that threatened to bring everything he had worked for crashing down. But in his mind, he wasn't the villain. He wasn't the one who had crossed the line. The people in front of him, the protesters, had become the enemy. They were the ones who were wrong, the ones who threatened his world, his order. Jeremiah could feel the pull of the crowd around him, the energy, the unified roar for justice. His pulse quickened, his senses sharpened. This was it. This was the moment that would define everything. No more words, no more excuses. He had taken a stand for his father. He had taken a stand for all the people who had been crushed under the boot of law enforcement for generations. He could feel the weight of his father's presence beside him, the old man standing tall despite the years that had bent his body. They had been through hell together. They had borne witness to the worst that society had to offer, and now they were going to see it through. As the officers began advancing, their batons raised, their shields locked in place, Jeremiah knew that they weren't just here to break up the protest. They were here to intimidate. They were here to remind the people of their place, but the people weren't afraid anymore. Jeremiah stepped forward, his voice cutting through the roar of the crowd. "This isn't just about us," he shouted, his words loud and clear, carrying over the chaos. "This is about every black man and woman who has been made to feel less than. This is about every life that has been dismissed, ignored, and discarded. We are not going anywhere. We will not be silenced." The crowd erupted in applause, their voices shaking the very ground beneath them. The officers flinched. They had been trained to handle these situations, but nothing could prepare them for the sheer intensity of the moment. The people were no longer afraid. They had found their voice. And that voice was growing stronger with every word, with every chant, with every step they took toward justice. Maddox's hands tightened around his baton, and for the first time, doubt began to creep into his mind. This wasn't what he had signed up for. He had joined the force to maintain control, to protect his community from the chaos he believed existed outside of it. He had believed in the narrative that had been fed to him for years, that the people on the streets were nothing more than troublemakers, that they were the ones who needed to be controlled. But now, standing here, watching the faces of the protesters, the families, the children who had come out to fight for their rights, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the wrong side of history. But the moment passed quickly. His training kicked in. He was a police officer. He was in charge. He wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to let them break him. "Move them back," Maddox barked, his voice sharp with authority, trying to mask the fear that had started to creep into his chest. Now. The line of officers advanced, pushing into the crowd with force, swinging their batons, shoving people back. The first blows landed with brutal precision, knocking protesters to the ground, scattering them like rag dolls. Screams echoed in the air as the police pushed forward, trying to break the unity, to silence the cries for justice. But it didn't work. The people stood firm. They weren't going anywhere. Jeremiah watched as his father stood tall, unaffected by the violence around him. He could see the fire in his eyes, the same fire that had carried him through wars, through the worst that humanity had to offer, was burning bright now. "Keep going," his father whispered, his voice low but steady. The words a simple command. "We've fought too long to stop now." Jeremiah felt his heart swell with pride. His father, the man who had bled for this country, who had fought in wars, who had seen the worst of humanity, was standing beside him, unafraid. And that was all the courage he needed. The crowd pushed back against the officers, fists raised, feet planted firmly in the ground. They weren't going to let this go. Not anymore. Maddox shouted for reinforcements, but they weren't coming fast enough. The people were too strong now. They had too much power, too much conviction. They weren't afraid of the badge. They weren't afraid of the guns. They were fighting for their dignity, for their right to be seen, to be heard, to be respected. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Then, from the back of the crowd, someone threw a bottle. It wasn't aimed at anyone in particular, but it shattered against the pavement, sending glass flying in all directions. The sound echoed through the street like the signal of a battle's beginning, and in that instant, everything broke loose. The police charged forward, swinging their batons with reckless abandon, aiming for heads, for ribs, for anyone who dared to defy them. People screamed, scattered, but they didn't run. They fought back. They didn't fight with violence, but with their presence, with their defiance. They were showing the world that they weren't just victims. They were warriors. Jeremiah grabbed his father's arm, pulling him back as the chaos swirled around them. "We have to keep moving," he shouted above the din of sirens and shouts. "We have to keep going." But his father shook his head, his grip steady as he pulled Jeremiah back towards the front of the crowd. "No, we stand. We don't move. We don't run." And so they stood. The riot escalated around them, officers clashing with the protesters, the sound of batons striking the bodies of the defiant echoing through the street. But for Jeremiah and his father, the battle had already been won. They had made their point. The world was watching. The world was seeing them, hearing them, finally. Officer Maddox, at the edge of the crowd, could see it now. He could see what this had become. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the system. It was about the people he had been sent to oppress, and for the first time, he felt the weight of his actions, the cruelty he had shown, the mocking he had delivered. He had no idea what kind of man the old man was, what kind of legacy he had carried. But in that moment, as the chaos unfolded, he knew one thing for sure. He had miscalculated, and now it was too late to turn back. The protests continued long into the night, a massive wave of resistance that could not be ignored. The city's police force, the political machine, and the wealthy elite who had controlled the narrative for so long were scrambling now, trying to regain control, trying to protect their precious power. But it was slipping through their fingers. The people had spoken, and there was no going back. Jeremiah stood in the thick of it all, his eyes on the horizon, where the first light of dawn was breaking through the darkness. He knew that the fight was far from over. It was only just beginning, but in that moment, standing beside his father, with the voices of the people ringing in his ears, he felt a deep sense of purpose. The reckoning had come, and no one could stop it now. The city had never felt so charged, so alive with the promise of change. What had started as a small ripple, an incident on a street corner, a few mocking words from an officer, had transformed into a wave of unrest, a storm of voices that refused to be silenced. The protests had continued, not as isolated events, but as a unified, unstoppable force. And in the midst of it all stood Jeremiah Holloway, his father at his side, both of them unyielding in their pursuit of justice. They had come this far, but the battle was far from over. The power structure that had kept the city divided, that had allowed racism to fester unchecked, was beginning to crack under the weight of the pressure being applied to it. And in the shadows of that system, those who had long been in control were starting to realize that their grip was slipping. Jeremiah had always known that the truth was dangerous. He had spent his life chasing it, digging into the stories that people didn't want to hear, uncovering the darkness that those in power worked so hard to keep hidden. But now, the truth was a weapon, and he was using it with every word he spoke, every story he wrote, every march he led. It was a weapon that no one could deny, no matter how hard they tried. But the people in power didn't give up so easily. They were used to being in control. They were used to dictating the terms, to shaping the narrative, to deciding who mattered and who didn't. And they were going to fight to keep it that way. The mayor's office had become a war room, the top brass scrambling to deal with the growing unrest. They had tried everything. They had sent in more police, hoping to intimidate the people into submission. They had smeared Jeremiah's name, trying to discredit him, paint him as a troublemaker, a radical, a man more interested in his own fame than in the truth. They had even tried to buy silence, offering him deals, telling him that they could make it all go away if he just backed down, just stopped talking about his father, stopped writing about the injustice he had uncovered. But Jeremiah wasn't interested in deals. He wasn't interested in their empty promises. He was interested in one thing, and one thing only: justice. The police had cracked down harder than ever before, using force to break up the crowds, to scatter the protesters, to intimidate them into giving up. But the people weren't backing down. Every time the police threw them back, they came back stronger, more determined. The streets were filled with the sound of chanting, of raised fists, of people demanding to be seen, demanding to be heard. But it wasn't just the protesters who were fighting now. The media, too, had begun to take notice. Jeremiah's article, his father's story, had spread like wildfire. The world was paying attention. The eyes of the nation were fixed on the streets of this city, and what they were seeing was not just a protest, it was a reckoning. In the midst of this turmoil, Officer Darnell Maddox had become a symbol, not just of personal cruelty, but of everything that was wrong with the system. He had become a lightning rod for everything the people were angry about, everything they had been fighting against for years. And now, as the protests continued to grow, so did the pressure on him. His name was everywhere, on social media, in news reports, in the mouths of every person who had taken to the streets. But Maddox didn't see it that way. He didn't see the crowds of people as a call for justice. He saw them as a threat to everything he had been taught to protect. He had been raised on a strict code, one that valued order over everything else, one that told him that people like Jeremiah and his father were the problem, that they were the ones who needed to be controlled. He had been taught to see the world in black and white, good and evil, right and wrong. And in his mind, he was the good guy. He wasn't the one in the wrong. He wasn't the one who had created this chaos. The people in the streets were. They were the ones who had forgotten their place. They were the ones who had crossed the line. Maddox was determined to maintain control, to prove to everyone that he was still in charge. He had already made one mistake, one act of arrogance that had brought him here. But now, he was going to make sure it didn't happen again. He was going to restore order. He was going to crush the rebellion, destroy the movement, and show the world that the system was invincible. But as Maddox stood there, his eyes locked on the growing crowd, a sense of doubt crept into his mind. He had been so sure of himself before, so sure that he was doing the right thing, that he was upholding the law. But now, with every passing minute, he could feel the weight of the crowd pressing down on him. They weren't just shouting at him, they were shouting at everything he had ever believed in. They were challenging the very foundations of his world, and that terrified him. The mayor, sensing the shift in the air, called an emergency meeting of the city's leadership. The situation had spiraled out of control. The protests weren't going away, they were only growing stronger, and the police were losing ground. The public was turning against them. They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. "We need to put an end to this," the mayor said, his voice low and urgent. "We can't let it go any further. We need to make an example of them." "But how?" one of the council members asked, his voice tinged with fear. "We've tried everything. We've tried force. We've tried negotiations. They won't back down." "We need to break them," the mayor said, his eyes cold. "We need to find their leader, the one who's stirring all of this up. Jeremiah Holloway. He's the one pulling the strings. If we get rid of him, the movement will fall apart." The room fell silent for a moment as everyone processed the mayor's words. They all knew what it meant. They knew that if they went after Jeremiah, if they silenced him, they could end the protests once and for all. They could restore order. They could bring everything back to the way it was. But they also knew what it would cost. They would have to make him disappear, one way or another. Maddox, still in the back of the room, clenched his fists. He had never been more sure of anything in his life. This was the moment. This was his chance to prove his loyalty, to prove that he was willing to do whatever it took to protect the system he had sworn to uphold. And if that meant silencing the voice of the people, silencing Jeremiah Holloway, then so be it. But as the plan began to take shape, something in Maddox's chest tightened. He had been a part of many operations before. Operations designed to bring down criminals, to stop violence, to protect his community. But this was different. This wasn't about protecting anyone. This was about crushing a movement, about destroying the very foundation of what they were fighting for. And in that moment, he realized something that terrified him. He wasn't fighting for justice. He was fighting for the system. He was fighting to protect the people who had always been in power, the ones who had created the very inequality and violence he had sworn to fight against. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks, and it was too late. The mayor's plan was already in motion. The city was already on the brink of collapse. The protests were only getting louder. The people were no longer afraid, and soon no one would be able to ignore it. No one would be able to turn away. The reckoning had come. The empire was falling. The morning sun rose over the city like a broken promise. The streets that had been alive with protest the day before were now eerily quiet, almost as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. In the heart of the city, the once powerful walls of control that had held the people in check were crumbling. The voices that had been stifled for so long were now rising together, their sound reverberating in the air like thunder before a storm. Jeremiah Holloway stood at the edge of the crowd, his eyes scanning the scene before him. His father beside him, their silent unity a testament to everything they had fought for, everything they had endured. The last few days had been a whirlwind of chaos. The protests had reached a fever pitch, a crescendo of defiance that could no longer be ignored. What had begun with a single act of cruelty had sparked something much larger, an unstoppable movement that had grown too powerful to be silenced. And yet, despite the growing demand for justice, despite the truth that had come crashing down on the system, the people in power, those who had built their empires on the backs of the oppressed, were determined to maintain control at all costs. The police force had been weaponized to crush the voices calling for change, but the more they fought back, the more the people resisted. The streets were a battleground now, and the fight wasn't just for one man's dignity, it was for the soul of a nation. Jeremiah could feel the weight of it all. His body ached from the sleepless nights, from the tension that had been building for weeks. But his mind was sharper than ever. The fight for justice wasn't just about the people who were out on the streets. It was about the millions of voices that had been silenced for far too long. The weight of history pressed down on his shoulders. But he wasn't backing down. He couldn't. He had seen the system for what it was, corrupt, flawed, and built to protect those who least needed protection. And now he was watching it tear itself apart. At the front of the march, his father, the old man who had been mocked by Officer Maddox, walked with slow, steady steps. His cane tapped against the pavement like the rhythm of an ancient drum, a sound that had echoed through the corridors of history. He had been through wars, through suffering, through unimaginable pain. But now, as he walked beside his son, his presence was a symbol of everything the system had tried to destroy. He wasn't just a survivor. He was a testament to the strength of those who had fought for their dignity, even when the world had tried to take it away. The march was moving forward, but as they reached the steps of City Hall, the mood shifted. The police were gathered in greater numbers now, their presence a visible attempt to intimidate, to force the protesters to turn back. Riot gear gleamed under the harsh lights of the city, and the officers stood in formation like soldiers preparing for war. But the people weren't afraid. They were angry, and they had nothing left to lose. Jeremiah knew this moment would come. He had been waiting for it, but it was different now. The violence that had been a constant undercurrent of the protests was no longer an isolated incident. It had become the system's response to anyone who dared to speak out, to anyone who dared to demand justice. He could see it in the eyes of the officers, the way they glared at the crowd as though they were the enemy. But they weren't the enemy. The enemy was the system, the structures that had been built to keep people like his father in their place, to silence their voices, to erase their history. "Stay strong," his father whispered, his voice low but firm. "We've come too far to stop now." Jeremiah nodded, his heart swelling with pride. His father had lived through so much, had endured more than any person should ever have to. But still, here he stood, unbowed, unbroken. His father's words had always been the foundation of his strength. But now, in this moment, those words carried more weight than ever. The crowd was chanting now, their voices rising in unison. They were demanding justice. They were demanding recognition. They were demanding a future where no one would ever have to endure the cruelty and humiliation that had been visited upon his father, upon all of them. But the city leaders, the ones who held the power, were not ready to give up their control. Not yet. At the front of the steps, the mayor stepped forward, flanked by his advisors, his expression hard, unreadable. He had spent the last few days in meetings, working with the police, working with the elites who controlled the media, trying to figure out how to stop this from spiraling further. But now, as he looked out over the crowd, he could see that it was too late. This wasn't something that could be controlled. This wasn't something that could be brushed under the rug. The people were awake, and they weren't going back to sleep. "I'm asking you to disperse," the mayor said, his voice projecting over the crowd. "This is your last warning. The police will take action if necessary." The words hung in the air like smoke, but the people didn't flinch. They stood their ground, their fists raised, their eyes burning with the intensity of everything they had been through. Jeremiah felt the fire inside him flare up, fueled by the stories of his father, by the stories of every person who had been mistreated, overlooked, and ignored. The mayor's words were meaningless now. The people had come to claim their place in history, to make sure they were seen, to make sure that their fight was heard. "You can't stop us," Jeremiah shouted back, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "We are not going anywhere. Not until we are heard. Not until we get justice." The crowd erupted in a roar of approval, and for a moment the city seemed to tremble beneath their feet. The power structures that had been in place for generations were cracking, splintering under the weight of the people's demands. And in that moment, Jeremiah knew that the fight was far from over. But he also knew that the moment of reckoning had arrived. Officer Maddox, standing off to the side, watched the exchange with a mixture of fear and anger. He had always believed in the system. He had always believed that his badge was a symbol of authority, of control. But now, as he looked at the people before him, he could see that his belief was crumbling. He had started this. He had mocked the old man, humiliated him, and now he was watching as everything he had stood for began to fall apart. Jeremiah locked eyes with Maddox from across the street, and in that brief moment, something shifted. Maddox had always seen people like him as inferior. He had always viewed them as less than. But now, staring into Jeremiah's eyes, he saw something different. He saw the resolve, the fire, the power that came from standing up for something larger than yourself. And for the first time, Maddox wasn't sure if he was on the right side. The tension in the air was palpable as the crowd pressed closer to the steps, the police tightening their formation, preparing for whatever might come next. Jeremiah's heart was pounding in his chest, but he didn't waver. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to back down now. "We've fought for too long," he said, his voice steady. "We've bled for this. We've sacrificed for this. And we will not stop until we are free. Until we are seen." The crowd erupted again, louder this time, their voices ringing out into the night. And in that moment, something deep inside the heart of the city shifted. The forces that had once held everything in place were beginning to crumble. The system that had sought to divide and oppress was finally being exposed for what it truly was: broken, corrupt, and unworthy of the people it had claimed to protect. Jeremiah and his father stood there, side by side, their eyes locked in silent understanding. They knew the road ahead would be difficult. They knew that change would not come easily. But for the first time in a long time, they knew they weren't alone. The reckoning had come. The battle had just begun, and the world was finally paying attention. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story in the comments. Have you ever experienced or witnessed racism in your life? Your experiences are incredibly valuable to us, and we deeply appreciate each and every one of you. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like if you enjoyed the story. Your support means the world to us. Have a great day, and if you've listened to the story all the way through, let us know by sharing a phrase that stood out to you the most.